The strip light above Nico Ferrara's desk was the only thing on in the room, and it made everything look like an interrogation. I suppose it was one. "Sit down," he said, not loudly, because Nico Ferrara never needed volume to land a point. I lowered myself into the chair across from his desk and focused on keeping my hands still. The leather was cold through my scrubs. I hadn't even had time to change after my shift before his driver appeared in the hospital parking garage with a polite smile and a very firm suggestion that I get in the car. He set a photograph on the desk between us, face up. Me, outside the Dunkin' on Wacker Drive 2 days ago, sitting across a small table from a man I had sincerely hoped no one would recognize. "Tell me what you were doing with Chris Darby," Nico said. I had a lot of answers I could have given him. I'd been rehearsing them the whole ride over. But sitting in that room, under that light, with his eyes on me, dark and perfectly still, every one of them dissolved. What surprised me most was that the feeling underneath the fear wasn't defiance. It was something closer to shame. Like I hadn't been caught by a dangerous man with dangerous resources, but had let down someone I'd genuinely come to care about. That distinction told me more about where I stood than anything I could have reasoned my way to. It had been 4 months since the night they brought Nico Ferrara into Bay 3 of Mercy General's trauma unit. I almost didn't take the assignment. Beth was supposed to cover Bay 3 that shift, but she was stuck managing a sepsis case down the hall, and the charge nurse looked at me, and I nodded before I thought about it. That's the thing about working trauma. You stop thinking and start moving, and by the time your brain catches up, you're already in the middle of whatever crisis walked through the door. What walked through that door was 6 feet of unconscious man, with a gunshot wound to the left shoulder. 2 men in dark suits flanking the gurney and scanning the room like hawks, and a third man who told the attending that the patient's name was Mr. F, and that they would appreciate discretion. I'd heard that kind of request before. I'd ignored it before, too. You don't have room for discretion when someone is bleeding. He came back to consciousness while I was cleaning the wound. His eyes opened, dark, immediately focused, and he looked at me without the disorientation most people had coming out of anesthesia, like he'd simply decided it was time to be awake and had gone ahead and done it. "You have steady hands," he said. "I need you not to move," I said back, and I felt the 2 men in suits shift behind me like I'd said something threatening. He didn't move. He watched me work instead. Something about that attention, measured, patient, made me concentrate harder than I usually had to, like being assessed, like getting it right mattered beyond the clinical. He was discharged against medical advice 2 days later. I didn't bother flagging it. You learn quickly which battles are worth picking in a trauma unit. 3 days after that, there was a coffee waiting at the nurse's station when I started my shift. From the cafe downstairs. My exact order? Large oat milk latte with 1 pump of vanilla, which I had never told a single person, because I was self-conscious about how specific it was. No note, I asked the cafe. They said a man had set up an account and left standing instructions. I didn't cancel it. That's the honest truth, and I'm not particularly proud of it. But I was 27 and pulling 12-hour shifts 4 days a week, and raising my 6-year-old nephew Tommy on a salary that covered the bills if I was careful and not much else, and someone had quietly noticed exactly how I took my coffee. I know how that sounds. I know it doesn't excuse what came later. But in that particular moment, it felt like being seen. Tommy was my sister Renee's son. Renee had died 18 months before, sudden cardiac event, no warning, no family history. Just one of those brutal random things the universe does without logic or mercy. Her ex-husband Brad had been gone for years, but the moment she was in the ground he resurfaced, full of claims about parental rights to a child he hadn't seen in 3 years. I'd hired a lawyer with money I didn't have. I was winning, slowly. But slowly is an expensive word. So I kept the coffee. 2 weeks later, I was walking to my car after a double shift. Past midnight, the parking garage half lit and half empty, when I heard footsteps behind me, too quick, too close. I spun with my keys out, heart slamming against my ribs. Nico Ferrara, and a conversation happening between him and the man who'd been following me that I couldn't hear over my own pulse. Within 30 seconds, the man was gone. Nico looked at me. "You parked too far from the elevator," he said. You're following me, I said. I'm aware of your surroundings. It's a different thing. I wanted to be angry. I was angry. I was also still shaking from the adrenaline, and he had just made a threat disappear in 30 seconds, and I didn't have anything left for the argument I deserved to have. Who was he? I asked. Someone who won't be a problem anymore. I found out later that he'd been hired by Brad's lawyer to build a harassment case against me. I never asked exactly what Nico said to end that arrangement. He started coming to the hospital coffee shop after that, once a week, maybe twice. Always in street clothes, always with one man waiting near the door, always with a single question, like he had a budget for conversation and used it carefully. How long had I been in trauma? What did I do when a shift broke me? What was Tommy reading this week? Nobody had asked me questions that were actually interested in the answers in a long time. You're small but you're fast, he said one afternoon, watching me navigate the crowded lobby, like a sparrow. I told him that was a ridiculous thing to say. He started calling me Sparrow instead of Ivy, and I never once asked him to stop. I knew who he was. Everyone in Chicago knew the name Ferrara, the way you know the name of a weather system, not the technical details, just the shape of it, what it meant when it arrived. I knew about the family, the history, the 3 federal investigations that had opened and closed without a single indictment. I knew his wife Elena had died 4 years ago, and left him with a son he was raising alone. I told myself to be careful. And then Tommy's birthday came, and Nico showed up with a Lego set. Tommy had circled in a catalog, and I'd told him maybe next month, and he crouched down to Tommy's level when he handed it over and asked, completely seriously, if Tommy was a builder. Tommy explained his entire architectural philosophy for the next 11 minutes. Nico listened to every word. I told myself to be careful and did not do a very good job of it. The call came on a Tuesday. I was in the break room between patients eating a granola bar when a man I'd never seen before sat down across from me and introduced himself as Chris Darby, freelance investigative journalist. He was building a piece about labor violations at 3 Ferrara construction sites on the south side. He understood my situation was complicated. There would be compensation for any information I could provide. He could also make sure my custody case received some sympathetic coverage. He was polite about it. That was the disarming part. I left the card he put on the table. I went back for it 20 minutes later. 2 days after that, I met him for coffee, told him I didn't have anything to tell, which was true, because Nico had never offered and I had never asked, and walked out thinking I'd handled it. And then the photograph ended up on Nico's desk. He approached me at the hospital, I said. The steadiness in my own voice surprised me. He said he was writing about your construction sites. He offered money for information, and he mentioned my custody case. Nico sat very still, and you met with him. I didn't give him anything. You met with him, he said again, not louder, just more exact. I know, I made myself hold his gaze. I should have told you immediately. I was scared of how you'd react, and that was wrong. I'm sorry. He reached across the desk and turned the photograph face down. Slowly, like he was putting something away. Darby isn't freelance, he said. He works for a man named Reyes, who has spent 2 years trying to fracture our Southside operations. Reyes targets people close to me. He looks for pressure points. He paused. Your Katsraznokas. Tommy's after-school schedule. These are pressure points. The words settled into my chest and went cold. Where is Tommy? I asked. At my penthouse. He turned from the window to face me. Lucia picked him up from his program 2 hours ago. He's had Todd dinner. He's watching a movie. He's fine. I was on my feet before I finished processing it. You took him without calling me. I couldn't reach you. You were with a patient. His voice was measured, but something underneath it had shifted. Not quite an apology, but the architecture of one. Rise had people outside the building, Ivy. I had 40 minutes. You don't get to make that call. He is 6 years old. For the first time his voice changed. Just slightly. Just enough. I was not going to leave him standing on that sidewalk. I stood there with the argument fully formed and unable to get it out. Because underneath the fury was the image of Tommy waiting outside his after-school program, not knowing why no one was coming, and men he didn't know in a car across the street. Take me to him, I said. The penthouse was in River North, top floor of a building I had walked past dozens of times without ever looking up. The elevator required a key card and a thumb scan. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space that felt nothing like I'd expected. No marble, no performance of wealth, warm light, shelves lined with actual books, a kitchen that smelled like someone had recently cooked in it. Tommy was cross-legged on a rug, in front of a television, with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and a bowl of buttered noodles going cold beside him. He looked up and launched himself across the room. I caught him and pressed my face into his hair, and for a moment couldn't do anything else. Lucia made noodles, he told me into my shoulder, and there's a pufferfish in the tank. Can we get one? We'll talk about it. That means no. That means we'll talk about it. I looked up. Nico was standing at the edge of the kitchen. Beside him was a small, dark-haired boy in pajamas, holding a book with both arms, watching Tommy with the careful assessment of a child who had learned to take his time about trust. He had Nico's eyes. "This is Felix," Nico said. He heard there was a visitor. Felix looked at Tommy for a measured moment. Tommy, who had no such process, said, "Do you want to see the blanket? It's the good one." Lucia put it in the dryer. Felix considered this for approximately 3 seconds. "Okay," he said, and crossed the room, and that was the entire negotiation. 2 boys who had never met, now sharing a blanket on a rug, debating pufferfish with the seriousness of experts. I stayed with Tommy until he fell asleep around 9. When I came back out, Nico was in the living room with 2 glasses of wine on the coffee table and the city spread out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Felix is down too," he said. I sat. For once I didn't perch on the edge of things. "I need to understand what I am to you," I said. "Because I've been telling myself this is manageable, that I know what this is. And then tonight happened, and I don't think I've understood anything." He was quiet long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at me with that particular precision of his, choosing each word deliberately, rather than letting them fall. "When Elena died," he said, "I decided not to want things that could be taken from me. It seemed like the cleaner way to live." He exhaled slowly. "And then you told me not to move, and you treated me like I was just a person in a hospital bed, not a name or a problem or a thing to be managed." A pause. I hadn't felt that in 4 years. I didn't know how much I missed it until it happened. I didn't say anything. Couldn't for a moment. "I know what I am," he continued. "I know what my family has been. I'm not going to dress it up for you. But I'm also not going to pretend you and Tommy aren't already in the future I'm building, because you are. You have been for months." "What are you building?" He told me more than I expected him to. The labor violations Darby had dangled as bait, real, and Nico had discovered them and had spent the last year cleaning them up at significant cost to himself. The legitimate real estate and logistics operations that were expanding as the older arrangements contracted. The conversations happening inside his own organization that were not going smoothly, with men who had built their lives around a structure he was methodically dismantling. He told me it would take 2 more years, maybe 3, and there was no guarantee it would be clean the whole way. "And in the meantime?" I asked. "In the meantime, I protect what matters to me." He met my eyes and held them. "That includes you and Tommy regardless of what you decide tonight." "I don't want to be protected out of obligation." "It's not obligation." He said it simply, the way you state something that isn't in question. I looked at the wine in my glass for a long moment. I'm not easy to be in a life with. I work nights. I come home with nothing left. Tommy is my first and only priority, and that doesn't move. And I will not be managed. What happened tonight, taking him without telling me? "Won't happen again without your knowledge," he said. "You have my word. Tonight was urgency. It wasn't control. There's a difference, and I understand why it didn't feel like one." He held my gaze. "I'd like to help with the custody case, if you'll allow it." "Through legitimate channels." A brief pause, primarily. I should have pushed harder on that. I chose not to. "I need time," I said, "to think about what this looks like for Tommy, what he sees, what he absorbs about how the world works." "That's fair. And I need you to actually talk to me, not manage what I know." "I'll work on it," he said. It doesn't come naturally. I've noticed. We sat with that for a while. Not comfortable exactly, not tense exactly, just two people with a lot unresolved between them, in the same room, willing to stay there. It was more than I'd expected when the night started. Before Lucia called the car, I stopped in the hallway. Legitimate channels, I said. Primarily legitimate, he said again. Nico. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough. Legitimate channels, he confirmed. 5 months later, Brad dropped the custody petition entirely. Nico told me his lawyer had made a reasonable assessment of his odds in court. I started to ask what that meant precisely. He handed me a coffee. Exact order, not a word about it, and I decided I believed him enough to let it be. Tommy and Felix had developed what Tommy called a city-cousin relationship, which meant Thursday evening FaceTime calls to debrief on the week with the gravity of people discussing quarterly earnings. Lucia had declared Tommy a natural at pasta making. Tommy had communicated this to me with a level of pride I felt in my sternum. I was on my way to Sunday dinner, the four of us. A standing thing that had materialized so gradually, I couldn't have told you which week it became permanent. When Nico called to say he'd be a few minutes late, he sounded like himself, but not quite. I asked if everything was okay. I need to ask you something, he said, in person tonight. You're scaring me. I don't mean to. A beat. I have a question and I need you to answer honestly, even if the answer isn't the one I want. I said okay, and hung up and sat in the car outside his building for a minute, turning that over, coming up with nothing that prepared me for walking inside, to find Felix standing in the hallway in a small button-down shirt, holding a handmade sign in both hands. Please say yes, it read, in Felix's careful 7-year-old lettering. Around the words were drawings, a fish, a blanket, what appeared to be a plate of noodles. Nico behind him, on one knee, a ring catching the light. Ivy. He looked up at me, and for once his voice wasn't measured. It was quiet and real, and slightly unsteady at the edges. I'm not simple, and I'm not finished, and I know you know both of those things. I can promise you, I'll be honest with you from here on. I'll choose you when it matters. I'll never make a decision about your life without you in the room. He paused. I can also tell you that Felix has been practicing that sign since Tuesday. And Tommy is in the kitchen and already knows what I'm asking, and has strong opinions about the cake. From down the hall, chocolate with the sprinkles. I was crying before I could stop it, not from sadness, just from fullness, from more than I'd known how to hold. Yes, I said, and Nico exhaled like he'd been waiting months to do it, and Felix made a noise that was half cheer and half shriek, and Tommy came running out of the kitchen with chocolate frosting on his shirt, because apparently he'd been given early and unsupervised access to the dessert. I looked at the three of them, Nico getting to his feet, Felix and Tommy colliding in the hallway like they'd been doing it their whole lives. And I thought about Bay 3-4 months ago, a man waking up on a trauma gurney and telling me I had steady hands and me deciding it meant nothing. It turned out it had meant everything.